Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I think I may have found a way to get through this paragraph here. As it turns out, if a concept is not related to reality, that means that it cannot be gotten at through the five senses. So if senses means sensible, then if it can't be gotten to through the senses, the Greeks had a word for that. Nonsense, right? Can't be gotten to through the senses. And that word has stood the test of time for good reason. So, what we're going to do is we're going to replace Immanuel Kant's words or phrases that don't refer to reality, that have no sense perception involved in their existence. They are something abstract, beyond, and not reducible in any way. Not just that they're an abstraction, but that they're a non-reducible abstraction. Okay? If they're a non-reducible abstraction, we're going to replace that word with the word nonsense. Okay? And we're going to see if that will clarify this paragraph a little for us. Now we're going to skip the center of the paragraph where he talks about the Egyptians, the Cape of Good Hope, and Diogenes Laertius. We're going to do a couple of sentences at the beginning of the paragraph to understand him a little bit. And then we're going to go down to the end of the paragraph. Okay. In the earliest times of which history affords us any record, math had already entered on the sure course of science among that wonderful nation, the Greeks. So he says math is great. Still, it is not to be supposed that it was easy for this science to strike into or construct itself that royal road, as it was for logic, in which reason only has to deal with itself. So science and math were a difficult thing. They're very advanced now, and everyone thinks highly of them. But logic and reason don't have to deal with all the external reality. They deal only with themselves. So right there, I think he lays bare his attitude towards logic and reason. They are floating abstractions, that they were produced by a giant. How they were produced, he doesn't understand, know, or care. Or if he understands how they were produced, he thinks, well, now here they are. However they were produced, here they are. And so he's going to use them going forward. So that's what I take that first sentence to mean. Then, alright, so it took a long time for this to develop. And then he says, a new light must have flashed on in the mind of the first man who demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle. For he found that it was not sufficient to meditate on the figure as it lay before his eyes, or the conception of it as it existed in his mind, and thus endeavor to get at the knowledge of its properties. But it was necessary to produce these properties, as it were, by a positive nonsense construction, and that in order to arrive with nonsense at a nonsense cognition, he must not attribute to the object any other nonsensities than those which nonsensibly follow from that which he himself had in accordance with his nonsense placed in the object. Okay? Now, if you don't think that that's clear now, then just get a copy of the text. I'll leave a thing below. And if you happen to be some person in the future who's watching this and you think you can explain that to me, just get it and clip it and put it in the comments and give your explanation. Okay? Alright, moving on. A much longer period elapsed before physics entered on the highway of science. For it is only about a century and a half since the wise Bacon gave a new direction to physical studies, or rather, as others were already on the right track, imparted fresh vigor to the pursuit of this new direction. Here too, as in the case of math, we find evidence of a rapid intellectual revolution. In the remarks which follow, I shall confine myself to the empirical side of natural science. He's going to stay away from the philosophical side of natural science. So that will give us a relief for a minute at least. When Galilei experimented with balls of a definite weight on the inclined plane, when Torricelli caused the air to sustain a weight which he had calculated beforehand to be equal to that of a definite column of water, or when Stahl, at a later period, converted metals into lime and reconverted lime into metal by the addition of and subtraction of certain elements, a light broke upon all natural philosophers. Sorry, there was a footnote in there which was in brackets from the translator. And he says, I do not follow the exactness of this, and indeed it is obscure. Okay. They learned that reason only perceives that which it produces after its own design. They learned that reason only perceives that which it produces after its own design. So whatever reason comes up with, the reason that it's come up with that is because it has designed it itself. Now that's quite an assertion. Okay? Now is that what we learn from science? The reason perceives that which it produces after its own design. That wouldn't make sense. That means we have to step outside of reason and look at reason learned that reason perceives only that which it produces after its own design. So it's supposed to perceive things it didn't produce after its own design? What would that mean? You know, that's a strange sentence to begin with, but then negate it and try it the other way. It's like, well, what are you talking about? What would that mean for reason to produce something that's not of its own design? So this is a nonsense sentence, but he is saying, he's making an assertion there. Whether it's nonsense or not, he is asserting that reason is limited in the sense that it can only perceive what it itself produces in its own way. You see? Like science produces in its own way its things, and that's all it can see. Okay, that's his assertion there. Whether it's garbage or not, that's his assertion. Okay, so they learned that reason only perceives that which it produces after its own design, that it must not be content to follow, as it were, in the leading strings of nature, but must proceed in advance with principles of judgment in according to unvarying laws, and compel nature to reply its questions. So he's upset that reason sets down something and then we go out and test it and find it to be true in the world. He's upset that we could go out into the world and that we could predict anything in that way. He's a little upset about that. And he's wondering where it gets that power from or something there. So let's go back and see why he's upset. They learned that reason must not be content to follow in the lead strings of nature. So he says reason doesn't just follow the lead strings and play along. It proceeds in advance with principles of judgment according to unvarying laws and compels nature to reply to its questions. Now he's jealous of that. He wants to do that in deep philosophy, in abstract philosophy unrelated to reality. He wants to advance in principles of judgment according to unvarying laws. So that's what he's going to try to set down in the mind, is unvarying laws, and to compel nature, in his case to compel the mind, to reply to its questions. That's what he's up to. All right, for accidental observations made according to no preconceived plan cannot be united under a necessary law. Accidental observations made according to no preconceived plan cannot be united under a necessary law. Okay, now, what is necessary law? If necessary means not, necessary means before the senses, right? So it does mean nonsense. All right? Accidental observations that just happen to be made in any given way cannot be united under a priori law. Okay, so just forget about random collections of sense data. Okay, it can't be united under necessary law. It's not to be thought about. It's not proper to use that as data. Data is not data. Don't worry about the data, okay? All your accidental observations is nonsense because it can't be united. You had no preconceived plan when you experienced those things, so forget about it, okay? But it is this that reason seeks for and requires. All right. So this which cannot be done is what reason tries to do. Okay? It is only the principles of reason which can give to concordant phenomenon the validity of laws. So it's only the principles of reason which can give to concordant phenomenon the validity of laws. And it is only when experiment is directed by these rational principles that it can have any real utility. Alright, so we have to use reason or else things can't be useful. Usefulness comes from reason. Useful science comes from reason. He says that. Okay. Reason must approach nature in this view. Indeed, of receiving information from it. Reason receives information from nature. Not, however, in the character of a pupil who listens to all that his master chooses to tell him, but in that of a judge who compels the witness to reply to those questions which he himself thinks fit to propose. So, reason only gets from reality a certain set of things that it asks for. It does not deal with the whole reality or the true reality because it does not approach reality as a pupil who listens to his master and who listens to what his master chooses to tell him, but that of a judge who questions what he himself is fit to propose. Okay. He does not like the way that science approaches reality, does he? He says science is a naughty little egoist. Science is so egoistical, he actually puts it in terms of somebody who sits in judgment over the information brought to them versus a humble pupil who accepts everything that comes at him. Now, if science wanted the whole reality, they would just accept the flood and just let everything come, instead of going out and asking reality specifically for the pieces that it wants. So, it's, maybe a messy analogy, but that's Immanuel Kant's analogy, okay? To this single idea must the revolution be ascribed, by which, after groping in the dark for so many centuries, natural science was at length conducted into the path of certain progress. So after centuries, natural science finally came to progress because of this single idea. This idea that you should just go to reality as the judge and ask reality for what you want and stop accepting everything as a pupil. So, he's a little upset about this. It's caused progress, but he doesn't like the way that we're going about it. We come now to metaphysics, a purely speculative science which occupies a completely isolated position and is entirely independent of the teachings of experience. Is it now? It deals with mere conceptions, not like mathematics with conceptions applied to intuition. And in it, reason is the pupil of itself alone. Man, he is hoity-toity, out in la-la land, Platonistic la-la land. Shameless. Shameless, too. He says the commoner deals with the senses. We're going to be sophisticated, right? It is the oldest of the sciences, and would still survive even if all the rest were swallowed up in the abyss of an all-destroying barbarism. Metaphysics is the oldest of the sciences, and will survive. But it has not yet had the good fortune to attain to the sure scientific method. Now then, the scientific method does not apply to metaphysics. Never mind. Okay, this will be apparent, okay, that it has not had the good fortune to attain to that level, will be apparent. If we apply the tests which we proposed at the outset, we find that reason perpetually comes to a stand when it attempts to gain a priori the perception even of those laws which the most common experience confirms. We find that reason perpetually comes to a stand when it attempts to gain nonsense when it attempts to gain nonsense about the perception of those laws, which the most common experience confirms. Alright. Reason comes to a stand when it attempts to gain a priori, or nonsense, of those laws. Alright, so reason cannot find an a priori source for these laws. A nonsense source. Literally a nonsense source. Literally a source without senses. Reason just can't get it. Okay? Like what? Newton's law of gravity and stuff like this? Okay. We find it is compelled to retrace its steps in innumerable instances and to abandon the path on which it had entered because this does not lead to the desired result. Now, what is he talking about there? Experiments? Or is he talking about philosophers? No, he's talking about philosophers because he's talking metaphysics, I think. Who knows? But he starts the paragraph with, we now come to metaphysics. So, he is talking about metaphysics here, I suspect. We find, too, that those who are engaged in metaphysical pursuits are far from being able to agree among themselves. But that on the contrary, this science appears to furnish an arena specially adapted for the display of skill or the exercise of strength in mock contests. A field in which no combatant ever yet succeeded in gaining an inch of ground, in which at least no victory was ever yet crowned with permanent possession. So, here we enter metaphysics and nobody has won yet, he says. In fact, nobody's got any territory at all. This leads us to inquire why it is that in metaphysics the sure path of science has not hitherto been found. Shall we suppose that it is impossible to discover it? Why then should nature have visited our reason with restless aspirations after it, as if it were one of our weightiest concerns? Well, not everybody is trying to just dive into their mind and figure out their mind's thoughts. Just you, Kant. Okay. It's our weightiest concern to dive into our mind and figure out our mind's mind. Okay. Nay, more how little cause should we have to place confidence in our reason if it abandons us in a manner about which most of all we desire to know the truth. And not only so, but even allures us to the pursuit of vain phantoms, only to betray us in the end. Or, if the path has only hitherto been missed, what indications do we possess to guide us in a renewed investigation, and to enable us to hope for greater success than has fallen to the lot of our predecessors? So how are we to go about this thing, making metaphysics into a science? Confidence in our reason, if it abandons us in a matter about which most of all we desire to know the truth. So if reason can't help us here, then reason is useless and we need to figure out some other way to go about using reason. Okay? And not only so, but even allures us to the pursuit of vain phantoms only to betray us in the end. Right? So we're running around confused in this field. So we're in desperate need of whatever Kant's trying to do for us here. So this field is a true mess, he says. No one's ever gained an inch of ground. Terrible battlefield. So it's in desperate need of his help. Alright, I got to take a breather for 2 seconds. Then we'll do this big paragraph. And then we'll be probably at the end of the time for the video. 20 to 25, 30 minutes. Oh dear. It appears to me that the examples of mathematics and natural philosophy, which as we have seen were brought into their present condition by a sudden revolution, are sufficiently remarkable to fix our attention on the essential circumstances of the change, which has proved so advantageous to them, and to induce us to make the experiment of imitating them, so far as the analogy which, as rational sciences, they bear to metaphysics may permit. Okay? Alright, it appears to me that the examples of math and natural philosophy are sufficiently remarkable because of things that are advantageous to them, that we should try to imitate them so far as metaphysics may permit us to imitate them. So we should try to imitate them so far as is permitted. The examples of math and natural philosophy should be imitated if we can do it. Okay. It has hitherto been assumed that our cognition must conform to the objects, but all attempts to ascertain anything about these objects nonsense, a priori, by means of conceptions, and thus to extend the range of our knowledge, have been rendered abortive by this assumption. So every time we try to learn about nonsense, we can't learn anything. Okay? Let us then make the experiment whether we may not be more successful in metaphysics if we assume that the objects must conform to our cognition. So let's not worry about the external world and the objects out there. Let's not worry about what's really out there. Let's just dismiss it and just assume that it will conform to our mind, because after all, we can't really know what's out there anyway, right? All we can know is what our mind builds when it sees the world. Therefore, let's just assume that objects must conform to our cognition. So whatever our mind is doing, that is what the real world is doing. We just have to assume that. This appears, at all events, to accord better with the possibility of our gaining the end we have in view, that is to say, of arriving at the cognition of objects a priori. So, if we do want to be able to think about things outside of and above the senses, without without evidence involved, without reality involved, then this is how we're going to have to do it. This appears to accord better with our possibility. Just assume that reality accords with our cognition, and then we will be able to think about things a priori. Okay? Then all of reality out there will just fit whatever we figure out our mind is doing, as long as we figure it out by logic. So if we figure something out that's logically consistent about what our mind is doing, it must needs be the case that that is what reality is doing. Okay? Because when we go out there and ask specific questions, we can put our mind in accordance with reality through that method. So it must be that all of reality out there is in accordance with our mind. We have to just assume that that's the case. And if that is the case, then we can just think about things inside of our mind, and they will have perfectly good implications in reality. Okay. This appears at all events to say arriving at cognition of objects a priori, of determining something with respect to these objects, understanding them, before they are given to us. So, if we want to know and understand and learn about things before we meet them in reality, then we have to assume that the things we think about and come up with in our mind match reality, or else we couldn't have come up with them, right? We use logic and reason inside of our mind, and the thing that we come up with must exist somewhere out there in reality, or we couldn't have come up with it through these means, okay? So, some respect to these objects before they are given to us. We here propose to do just what Copernicus did in attempting to explain the celestial movements. When he found that he could make no progress by assuming that all the heavenly bodies revolved around the spectator, he reversed the process and tried the experiment of assuming that the spectator revolved, while the stars remained at rest. We may make the same experiment with regard to the intuition of objects. Alright, so he wants to take us out of being central. Alright, so now that was just mathematics or science of the time. Copernicus said, you know, everybody thought the Earth was at the center of the universe, and then we discovered, no, it's just a tiny, tiny moving object. So he wants to do that now with humans, right? His anti-man, anti-life hatred of mankind is showing through. And he wants to decentralize human beings in philosophy. So he wants it so that we are just a little traveling thing in philosophy rather than the center around which all philosophy rotates. So the spectator revolved while the stars remained at rest. We may make the same experiment with regard to the intuition of objects. If the intuition must conform to the nature of the objects, I do not see how we can know anything of them a priori. Right? So, if we actually have to go out to reality to learn about these things, then we couldn't have had any a priori knowledge at all. If intuition must conform to the nature of the object, then I don't see how we can have anything of them a priori. So intuition must not conform to the nature of the object. It must come before the nature of the object. So now the word intuition means before the senses. Okay, now as of this sentence, okay? If, on the other hand, the object conforms to the nature of our faculty of intuition, I can then easily conceive of the possibility of such a priori knowledge, right? So, if reality conforms to our mind, then sure, we have lots of a priori knowledge, which clearly we have, right? Which we actually don't have. Now, as I cannot rest in the mere intuitions, but, if they are to become cognitions, must refer them as representations to something, as objects, and must determine the latter by means of the former. Here again there are two courses open to me. Either, first, I may assume that the conceptions by which I effect this determination conform to the object, and in this case I'm reduced to the same perplexity as before. So I have to go out to reality and figure out how my mind should be by looking at reality. Either it's that way, or secondly, I may assume that the objects, or, which is the same thing, that experience of the object, in which alone, as given objects they are cognized, conform to my conception. So which is it? Does conception conform to the object, or does the object conform to the conception? But if he says, if I allow the object to conform to my conception, in other words, if I started with a conception in my mind, and I go out there, and there's the object, and I receive the object, but when I receive the object, it's just meeting the construction I already had in my mind. Now, if that's the case, he says, and then I am at no loss how to proceed. So, if reality works in that way, if our mind is first and then we just go out into reality and find the things that are in our mind, then he says everything would make perfect sense that way and I can proceed easily. For experience itself is a mode of cognition. Experience is a mode of cognition. Well, experience comes before cognition. But he says it's a mode of cognition, which requires understanding. Okay. Experience itself requires understanding. Okay? That's a pretty bald assertion. Alright? You can experience without understanding. Right? Helen Keller had to be able to experience without understanding, or she never could have come to understand. But he says experience is a mode of cognition which requires understanding. Before objects are given to me, I must presuppose in myself laws of the understanding which are expressed in conceptions a priori. So, before objects are given to me, before the senses, I must presuppose in myself laws of the understanding which are expressed in conceptions about that. Now, okay, let's do that sentence for fun. Let's do it the Immanuel Kant style way. And let's just put the word nonsense in where he has used a word that doesn't reduce to reality, okay? before objects that are nonsense to me, that is, nonsense, I must presuppose in myself laws of the understanding. Let's take the laws of the understanding out and put nonsense there too, okay? Before objects are nonsense to me, that is nonsense, I must presuppose in myself nonsense, which is expressed in conceptual nonsense. Okay? So there's 4 words or phrases in there that are just floating garbage. So that sentence is really floating garbage. Now, we can think it through and try to understand what he means because we're trying to do Kant, but let's just realize that that is a sentence full of nonsense, okay? So here's the sentence. Before objects are given to me, that is a priori, I must presuppose in myself laws of the understanding which are expressed in the conceptions a priori. To these conceptions, then, all the objects of experience must necessarily conform. So there are conceptions in our mind that come before reality, and all reality is just discovering these conceptions in our mind, okay? By necessity. He's figured this out through logic, okay? Now there are objects which reason thinks, and that necessarily, but which cannot be given in experience, or at least cannot be given so as reason thinks them. The attempt to think these objects will hereafter furnish an excellent test of the new method of thought which we have adopted, and which is based on the principle that we can only cognize in things a priori that which we ourselves place in them. We can only cognize in things nonsense that which we ourselves place in them. And what does place mean? It's nonsense. We can only cognize in things nonsense that which we ourselves nonsense in them. Very good sentence there. Okay. Now he has a footnote. In case he hasn't been clear, he has a footnote that's like 10 lines long. Okay. Just in case he wasn't clear. Footnote. This method, accordingly, which we have borrowed from the natural philosopher, consists in seeking for the elements of pure reason in that which admits of confirmation or refutation by experiment. We have borrowed from the natural philosopher. This method, which we borrowed from the natural philosopher, consists in seeking for the elements of pure reason in that which admits confirmation or refutation by experiment. All right. So we've borrowed a method from the natural philosopher that usually uses experiment. Now the propositions of pure reason, especially when they transcend the limits of possible experience. Oh dear. All right, so I better continue this footnote. Well, let me try. I'm going to bowl through. We're going to finish this footnote, and then we'll be at the end of this video. Now, the propositions of pure reason, especially when they transcend the limits of possible experience, do not admit of our making any experiment with their objects, as in natural science. So we can't experiment with reason. Hence, with regard to those conceptions and principles which we assume a priori, our only course will be to view them from 2 different sides. Okay, so if we view things as coming before sense, in other words, if we view things as being nonsense, then we're going to have to view them as having 2 sides. Okay? We must regard one and the same conception, on the one hand, in relation to experience as an object of the senses and of the understanding, and on the other hand, in relation to reason, isolated and transcending the limits of experience. So again, he's got the senses and reason. Transcending the limits of experience as an object of mere thought. Okay? Now, if we find that when we regard things from this double point of view, the result is in harmony with the principle of pure reason, but that when we regard it from a single point of view, reason is involved in self-contradiction, then the experiment will establish the correctness of this distinction. So, if we can get an experiment inside of our mind where we can find a contradiction in one direction, but not a contradiction in the other direction, then we know that that's the correct direction to go in. Okay. And the correct direction he says to go in is to view things as real and reason as floating, super real, transcendental, right? Okay. Transcending the limits of experience. Reason transcends the limits of experience, so there are the things that we can experience, and then there's reason. Reason is separate from reality. Okay? If we view it like that, then he can't find any contradiction in that, so he thinks that's a solid way to go. Okay, there you are, ladies and gentlemen. Immanuel Kant's Confused. Throw me a few bucks on Patreon, please. I'm doing this stuff to make some money. I don't know if it's going to be Immanuel Kant forever, but doing a debate with Victor Pross in a couple days, and did an interview with a watcher, a viewer, Doug, longtime fan, and so and I'll do lots more stuff. If I get enough Patreon support, we'll do more stuff. So please join me. Go pile on in Patreon. Give me $5 or $10 a month and help me build up a stream of revenue. And support Objectivism in Action, or something like that, Objectivism in Action on YouTube. I would like to go out and do debates and stuff if I get enough revenue stream. Alright, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Cropper out.